Hello everyone and welcome back to our reading of Vampires. Today we ask the question, how can vampires be explained? Let's find out. Belief in vampires was originally the result of and has continued to be nourished by certain facts. For example, a dead body appears pale or even grey because the blood collects in the back of the body. The sight of such a body might easily suggest a body drained of blood, the work of vampires, to people who do not know the physical reason for the paleness. There are many other natural and scientific factors that have contributed to the belief in vampires. Catalepsy. Catalepsy is suspended animation. It is the state of a person who is alive but whose breathing, pulse, and other vital signs have slowed down so much that the person seems dead, even to trained doctors. This condition is probably the result of a disorder of the nervous system. Catalepsy is not permanent. Cataleptics can see and hear, but cannot move even an eyelash. Imagine the trauma of hearing yourself pronounced dead, of sensing the earth shoveled on your coffin, of coming out of catalepsy and gasping for breath as you attempt to claw your way out of the confinement of your coffin. Montague Summers, one of the most important students of supernatural phenomena, noted that statistics in the United States from the early 20th century record as many as 50 known cases of premature burial each year. In modern times, it has become the law in most places that dead bodies must be embalmed before burial. The embalming, which is done by undertakers, replaces blood with preserving fluids that prevent decay. Catalepsy is thus no longer a problem. If a person is not really dead but merely cataleptic, after embalming, he or she is certainly dead. Through most of history, the dead were buried without embalming. If a person was in a cataleptic trance, he or she might be buried alive. This was no doubt one reason for the widespread custom of holding a 1 or 2 day rake before burial. People still hold rakes or visitations today, though the original reason is not known to many people. Since exhumation was quite common because of belief in vampires, we must suppose that an occasional cataleptic was exhumed. Moreover, grave diggers probably heard once in a while some groan or other sound coming from a recent grave. In these cases, what the examiners saw upon opening the box or casket must have been horrifying. The hands would be bloody from the futile, frantic attempts of the person to scratch his or her way to freedom. The blood-spattered face would be contorted in the expression of one practically scared to death and finally dead by suffocation. Here everyone would agree was surely a vampire. The blood, they would say, was that of its latest victim. In 1851, Dr. Herbert Mayo published his book on the truths contained in popular superstitions. He was convinced that bodies found in the so-called vampire state were the bodies of persons who had been buried alive. Other factors in vampire superstition troubled him, however. He puzzled over why people who believed they had been visited by a vampire often fell into a death-like trance. He finally concluded that people of weak disposition could be strongly affected by their dreams. The dream of a vampire visit could result in a powerful conviction that the visit had really occurred. Such impressionable people might indeed fall into a death trance, coma, or cataleptic state. In Eastern European communities where the vampire cult was strong, the problem could become epidemic. Yet Mayo could not convince himself that his explanation was the correct one. He wrote, "To myself I must confess, this explanation, the best I am in a position to offer, appears barren." Thus Mayo, like many before him, remained puzzled by the sheer weight of the evidence, the many eyewitness accounts, stories, and examples. He found his explanation lacking, and was gnawed by some nagging doubt that perhaps no scientific explanation was adequate to explain vampires. Porphyria. In the last 5 years, medical explanations have been offered that account for both vampire and werewolf beliefs. A leading theory states that supposed vampires and werewolves may have been suffering from a rare hereditary blood disease known as porphyria. Porphyria is characterized by the inability of the body to produce heme, a component of hemoglobin, which is a major component of red blood. Today, there are effective treatments for porphyria, such as the injection of healthy blood heme. Without treatment, however, the porphyria sufferer could have horrible symptoms such as extreme sensitivity to sunlight, which can cause sores and scars on the skin, and excessive hairiness. In severe cases, the fingers and nose sometimes fall off. The skin of the gums and lips might tighten and stretch, causing the teeth to appear very prominent and fang-like. Porphyriacs would avoid sunlight because of their sensitivity, probably coming out only at night. If they were seen, they were probably a horrible sight, hairy and repulsive. They might suck the blood of some small animal, or of someone close to them. Without knowing why, they had the urge to do this. Porphyriacs were driven in a desperate attempt to acquire the heme their bodies could not generate. Porphyria is hereditary. In some cases, relatives have been bitten for their blood simply because they were handy when the porphyria sufferer needed an immediate supply. These victims might later show the same porphyria symptoms and seem to become vampires as the result of having been bitten by one. The truth is that they had already acquired porphyria at birth, since the disease is hereditary. Moreover, in earlier times, when travel was less common and inbreeding more common, the hereditary factor played a larger role. The occurrence of the disease in many members of a community might well have fostered a belief in the transmission of vampirism from one person to another in a certain village or community. Oddly, garlic, which stimulates heme production in healthy people, contains a chemical that worsens the painful symptoms of porphyria. Wearing garlic would therefore protect someone from being attacked by a porphyriac. The poor porphyriac would avoid any contact with garlic because it caused pain, not because he or she was a vampire. This bit of folklore, that garlic can protect one from a vampire, apparently may have some basis in scientific fact. This theory was first introduced in 1985 by Dr. David Dolphin of the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. The vampire as astral body projection. Scott Rogo, writing in Fate magazine, which is devoted to occult subjects, suggests that vampires do exist. They are not, however, physical beings or always evil, Rogo stresses. He offers an interpretation that fits very well some of the documented descriptions of vampire activity. Rogo is a parapsychologist, a person who studies occult and psychic phenomena, and believes that every living thing has a spiritual astral body that can actually be projected outside the physical body. He cites the work of the French psychic Z.T. Perard, who wrote that vampires may be the astral bodies of people prematurely buried. The astral body acts instinctively, not rationally. It leaves the physical body to vampirize living things of their vitality in order to nourish itself. Franz Hartmann, a Viennese physician and psychic, agrees and traces the idea of the astral body to the Renaissance chemist Paracelsus. Hartmann thinks that someone who is dead may project an astral body that can materialize and live an apparently normal life, as some vampire accounts relate, by draining life energy from the living. A striking example is the case of 19th century Molly Fancher. She was blind and crippled and lived under medical observation for years without eating any substantial food, but animals brought into her presence died almost immediately without being maltreated in any way. Was this a case, Hartmann asked, of her astral projection drawing off nourishment from the animals in order to keep Molly alive? The vampire as bloodthirsty mass murderer. History has recorded cases of individuals who craved human blood for one reason or another. Their murder trials are well documented, with the testimony of witnesses. These blood seekers were not corpses. They were living people, but their abnormal bloody activities may have caused people to believe they were vampires. One of the most famous examples is Vlad Dracula of Romania, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's novel Dracula. Vlad spent the greater part of his life defending his lands and his people's Christian religion against the Ottoman Turks. Dracula is honored as a Christian warrior and is considered a great patriot by the people of Romania. There was, however, another side to the man. In 1458, Dracula raided the Romanian town of Brasov, impaling hundreds of German citizens on top of St. Jacob's Hill. He became known as the Impaler because this was his favorite method of execution. Around 1470 in Frankfurt and elsewhere in Germany, pamphlets contained accounts of the Brasov raid, with a drawing of Dracula dining amid the stakes of his impaled victims, and the headless bodies at his feet. He seems to be feasting on human flesh and blood. This picture may be one reason he became associated with Romanian vampire legends. German and Russian pamphlets recall Dracula's cruelty to Saxons residing in his lands. They show him as a demented psychopath. One manuscript even refers to him as a vampire, since his cruelty is emphasized by many different people. Scholars assume that it is true. Dracula and cannibalism. Two anecdotes emphasize Dracula's fascination with cannibalism. In one, some 300 Mogul Tartars strayed into Dracula's territory. Dracula took the 3 best men among them and had them fried. The others were made to eat them. Dracula then said, "You will eat each other in the same way unless you go fight the Turks." The Tartars were happy to go and fight the Turks. In the second story, Dracula caught a gypsy who had stolen. Other gypsies came to beg his freedom. Dracula ordered them to hang the thief when they said it was not their custom. Dracula then had the gypsy boiled in a pot, and when he was cooked, Dracula forced the others to eat him, flesh and bone. Was Dracula a vampire? If vampires were living, breathing, bloodthirsty mass murderers, perhaps he was. It is certainly true that his name and the concept of the vampire were joined together first and forever in the mind of Bram Stoker. Curiously, when archaeologists opened Dracula's grave in 1931, he was not in it. The strange and horrifying story of Countess Elizabeth Bathory is another example of a murderer whose activities resemble those of a vampire. This countess lived in Szigety Castle in the Carpathian Mountains of Hungary. Her marriage was one of the great society events of the day. Even the Habsburg Emperor Maximilian II attended. Her trial was equally huge, and her notoriety spread among the nobility. As the story goes, once when Elizabeth slapped her maid, her face was stained from the girl's bloody nose. Wiping off the blood, she noticed that her complexion seemed fresher. This set off a series of horrible crimes that became fully known only during Elizabeth's trial in 1611. Determined to keep her whole body looking young and fresh, she regularly took baths in the blood drained from the bodies of young girls murdered in her own castle. She would lure them there with promises of employment. Poor, older widows in neighbouring towns were paid round to procure the girls. As unbelievable as this story seems, it was taken directly from the statements of her maids at Elizabeth's trial. The raid of the castle by the authorities discovered several girls in different stages of torture. In the main hall lay a girl, dead and drained of blood. A list found in Elizabeth's desk, written in her own hand, put the number of her victims at 650. Their bodies were disposed of in various cemeteries and in the castle dungeons. Elizabeth was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment in her bedroom. All the doors of her bedroom were walled up, with only a small opening for food to be passed through. She lived nearly 4 years in this condition. Acceptance of vampires. Well-publicized cases such as this one would encourage the widespread acceptance of vampires. The following cases had the same impact. The figure dubbed in the French press in 1883 as the Monster of Montleuil was in reality two fiendish people, a young man named Martin Dumoulin and an older, dominating woman named Justine Lafayette. Lafayette had perverse control over the young man and ordered him to kill a 15-year-old girl. Dumoulin killed her by ripping open her throat and draining her body of its blood. He also mutilated the corpse. This was the first of 80 nearly identical murders in 5 years. After a sensational trial in 1888, Lafayette was beheaded by the guillotine, and Dumoulin was imprisoned in an asylum. Fritz Harman was known as the Hanover Vampire at his trial in 1924. He ran a butcher shop with a cooked food deli counter in Hanover, Germany. Harman would linger in railway stations, befriend young men between 12 and 18 years old, and invite them to his rooms. After serving them a fine meal, he would bite their throats until they died. He then sliced the tenderest parts of their bodies and sold the flesh at his deli counter, sometimes as sausages. All this came out at his notorious trial, at which at least 24 victims were counted. In 1931, Peter Curtin, the monster of Dusseldorf, was brought to trial. A journalist covering the case reported the most extraordinary and horrible point about Curtin's nocturnal prowling lay in its association with the vampire and werewolf of ancient tradition. It was his habit and principal satisfaction to receive the stream of blood that gushed from victims' wounds into his mouth. Curtin committed 29 murders of this sort. He was diagnosed as suffering from hematodipsia, literally a thirst for blood. He would struggle and cut the throats of his victims and drink their blood. He received 9 death sentences. A very famous vampire trial took place in England in 1949. John Hay had murdered 9 people by drinking blood from their throats. He testified in court that he had a recurrent dream of a forest in which crucifixes turned into trees that ran with blood from their branches and trunks. A man offered him a cup filled with blood, but he was always too paralyzed to take it. Each time he awoke, frustrated and thirstier for blood. Finally, he slit the throat of a friend and drank the blood directly from his neck. After this, he murdered several other people, collecting their blood in glasses in order to drink it. Living vampires. Clearly, there have been living vampires, to the extent that the vampires seek out and drink the blood of the living. These mass murderers all fit the definition. Whether or not early stories are based on similar murders is hard to say, but it would be an easy leap for people who already believed in vampires to think that a murderer who craved blood was a vampire. It continues to be one possible explanation. One of the most persuasive and thorough explanations for vampires has been proposed by Paul Barber in his book Vampires, Burial and Death. A former professor of German language and folklore, Barber believes that what 16th and 17th century vampires found when they opened graves can be easily explained. Barber argues that when a grave was opened, people present saw a body in a perfectly normal state of decomposition or decay. As he says, one must learn about the reality of death and decay in order to understand the folklore of death and decay. If the vampire hunters had known what a decaying body should have looked like, they would not have been shaken by what they saw. It was their interpretation of what they saw that was wrong. In 1591, for example, in Silesia, then part of Germany, a shoemaker committed suicide. After he was buried, several people in the village claimed they saw him alive and doing mischief. Town leaders dug up his grave 8 months after he died to inspect it. According to their report, the body was still intact, but blown up like a drum. There was no sign of decay or stiffness. Skin on his feet had pulled away, but new skin appeared to be forming. The body did not smell. After they reburied him, people again said they saw him rocking. Finally, he was exhumed again. His hands, feet, head, and heart were removed and cremated. After this, He was not seen again. Body decay. What are the normal processes that occur in the grave that would explain what these people saw? First, the bloating of the body is caused by a rapid growth of bacteria that produces methane gas inside the body. In some cases, the gas causes the body to expand to 3 times its normal size. What one sees on the mouth and other openings of the body is not fresh blood. It is frothy, liquefied tissue and decomposing blood. In time, the eyes bulge, the tongue protrudes, and the face rounds so that the features become grotesque. Blisters may erupt where the skin has split. The appearance of new skin is also naturally explained. Skin slippage or peeling occurs in normal decomposition. What is underneath is not really new skin, but looks like it. Another vampire account provides more information to be interpreted. In Serbia, in the year 1727, Arnold Paula died in an accident. Shortly before, he had revealed to his fiancée that he had been troubled by a vampire while in the army in Turkey. He had taken certain precautions to avoid becoming a vampire himself. He had eaten earth from the vampire's grave and had smeared himself with vampire blood. He had finally destroyed the vampire in his grave. Despite all this, after Paula had been buried about a month, 4 people in his village died. Before their deaths, they had complained of being haunted by Paula, and then they had become extremely weak. His grave was opened. The district governor supervised the investigation. Paula's body seemed still fresh. His nails and skin had fallen off and been replaced by new nails and skin. His veins were full of liquid blood that had splashed all over his shroud. The people present were convinced that Paula had indeed become a vampire. As they drove a stake through his heart, witnesses heard him give a piercing shriek, and the wound bled. They burned his body and returned the ashes into his grave. What these witnesses experienced relates to natural body decay. In a month, the body would not appear to have decomposed very much, but on the inside, gases, decaying tissue, and blood may have caused Paula's stomach to burst, causing the stains on his shroud. What seems to be a continued growth of nails or teeth, in some accounts, is really not. It is merely the shrinking back of gums and skin. This causes the teeth and nails to appear longer than they were in life. Paula's shriek can also be explained. According to Barber, the stake caused the swollen body to burst with the force of pent-up gases. The noise the corpse made occurs when the gases rush out past the glottis, the opening in the throat between the vocal cords. This is exactly what happens when people speak. Air from the lungs vibrates the glottis, causing sound. Shallow graves. Other events related in vampire records include noises coming from the grave, which persuaded people that the corpse within was undead. Barber notes how in times of plague many corpses were buried hastily in shallow graves. The sounds of released gases or of the shifting of the body might then have been heard above ground, leading people to believe the corpse was a vampire. Shallow graves may also have been responsible for hands or even whole bodies protruding from the earth. Rain might have eroded or washed away the soil to expose the body. Scavenging dogs or wolves might have dug up the body. These natural events would have been interpreted by peasants in terms of their own powerful belief in vampires. Still, and some vampire records and putrefied bodies have been dug up even a year after death. Why did these bodies not seem to decay? Barber explains that decomposition can be hastened or slowed, depending on many factors. The amount of moisture, lime, or antibiotics in the soil affects the rate of decay. How airtight the coffin is, if one is used at all, and whether the person was buried in winter or summer also affect the decay rate. Air and moisture quicken the corpse's decomposition. The presence of lime or antibiotics slows the process. In ancient Egypt, for example, the dryness of the climate and a salt lake substance called natron in the desert sand caused a natural preservation to take place and made mummification possible. Another factor that affects the rate a body decomposes is the way a person dies. When death comes suddenly, as by murder or accident, or to a young person, decomposition is slower. It is important to notice that most vampire accounts center around people who have died in just such unusual circumstances. By digging up the graves of accident, murder, or suicide victims, people would have been more likely to discover a body that fit their conception of a vampire. Barber's insights have shed much light on the persistence of vampire belief throughout history. Noises are heard in cemeteries, and superstitious people fill in the gaps with their own interpretations. Crazed and bloodthirsty murderers have made the superstition more believable. Cases of catalepsy and porphyria have certainly promoted it. Any of these might be a plausible explanation for the mystery, but even these scientific explanations cannot eliminate the mystery of the vampire. The fascination by this haunting figure continues today. Well now, wasn't that a very long and very interesting chapter? Anyway, that's all for today. I'll see you next time. See ya!